Hello, this is Andy Ellis. We're here tonight with the Baltimore City Green Party Educational Series. Tonight we're joined by Dayvon Love of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We're mostly going to talk about bail reform efforts in the state of Maryland. But first, Dayvon, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle?
So, as Andy mentioned, my name is Dayvon Love. I'm Director of Public Policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We're a grassroots political think tank that does two things primarily. We train young people in public policy using the tool of policy debate. We also engage in advocacy in the public policy arena to advance the interests of Black people, both in Baltimore and the state of Maryland.
So, what are some of the advocacy projects that you've worked on in the past?
So our first effort was stopping the construction of a $104 million juvenile detention facility in East Baltimore. So we were able to be successful in stopping the construction of that facility. We also worked on police reform, primarily more civilian participation and discipline for law enforcement officials. And, as we'll talk about later, working on pretrial and bail reform as well.
And so you mentioned that you get young folks involved through the process of policy debate. How does that work with the policy debate leading to the actual advocacy?
So we have a camp called the Eddie Conway Liberation Institute. So we've done it 4 years, 4 summers in a row. It's a 3-week residential debate camp. We take students from Baltimore around the country, train them in policy debate, but the camp is centered around the focus on social justice and the cultivation of Black cultural identity. And so a lot of our students that we train both at our camp and just other debate workshops and seminars, we've mentored them to use their skills to do protests, to do advocacy, to do workshops. So they get the myriad of skills necessary to really pick from whatever tool of advocacy they want to participate in to advance, any particular effort they work.
All right. So what we're here to talk about today is the bail system in Maryland and the efforts going forward to reform it. Can you give folks a brief understanding of where bail is in Maryland, what the situation is, and why it needs reform?
So the cash bail system is a system that goes back decades. And the basic premise of the bail system is this idea that, want to ensure a person shows up to court. And the tool that traditionally has been used is cash bail, right? This idea that pay a certain amount of money. If you've been charged with something, say you've been convicted, you've been charged with something. The idea is that if there's a feeling that you may not show up to court, the idea is to use bail as a mechanism to ensure you show up. And there's really a fundamental issue with that, right? Because essentially we're putting a price tag on a person's freedom who has not been convicted of anything. So a part of what has been happening, there's some legislators that sent a letter to the Attorney General asking for the Attorney General of Maryland, Brian Frosh, to render an official opinion about the pretrial system in Maryland. And what essentially happened back in October was that the Attorney General wrote an opinion that essentially said that the bail system in Maryland is unconstitutional. And the primary rationale for that was that there are a lot of people who are incarcerated pretrial because they didn't have the money to pay for it. So that sparked a move within the Maryland Court of Appeals, the highest court in Maryland, to essentially hand down a Court of Appeals ruling that essentially, it says a bunch of things, but essentially what it says is that judges should exhaust non-financial conditions before they even give cash bail. And the idea is you prefer release on recognizance. So you prefer that if a person is charged with a crime, you prefer that they get released on recognizance if they're not a threat to public safety. And that if they're not a threat to public safety, and that the commissioner, the judge or the court commissioner finds that there need to be additional conditions to ensure a person shows up, you start with non-financial things. Maybe, a text messaging system where they get a text message. Maybe they have to report to someone.
So I want to get back to the Court of Appeals decision in a minute, but are there examples in the state of Maryland where people are using non-cash means of handling bail right now?
So we have, so in St. Mary's County is a county that recognized that its jail population was large and it was costing the state money. And in fact, one of the things that they did was try to have a system where some of the sheriffs would check in on some of the folks that were awaiting trial. And not only were they able to save $400,000 as a result of doing this, but also decrease their prison population by about 19%. In the state of Maryland, 60 to 65% of folks incarcerated in the state of Maryland are incarcerated pre-trial. And so what Captain American of St. Mary's County did was innovative in the sense that the problem of the overcrowding of the prisons prompted him to use a solution that very much models what it is that we're attempting to do. And again, it can be things as simple as checking in on someone reporting every once in a while. The example we use is, there's a Baltimore community mediation program that already has a relationship to courts. So if you and I got into a fight, we get charged for second-degree assault instead of paying bail, maybe a part of the non-financial conditions would be to go to community mediation.
So things like that currently that have relationships with the court system don't have relationships with the pretrial system in a lot of cases.
Right.
And so in St. Mary's County, they established those relationships with the pretrial system so that they could make sure that people got what they needed instead of bail.
Exactly.
And how since the goal is to get people to show up, right? In St. Mary's County, how has that worked? Have people been showing up?
Well, according to Captain American, who testified in the House Judiciary Committee a few weeks ago, he said that their appearance rate is high. I don't have the exact number, but he was very pleased with the appearance rate, that it was more effective than what they were doing before.
So we have this pretty good example in the state of Maryland that can work as an alternative. Now, did the Court of Appeals take that into account when they made their decision?
I'm not sure if they took that particular example into account. I think what a lot of the conversation through the Court of Appeals process was simply, well, two things. One is obviously Attorney General Frosch's opinion. So I think the court felt compelled that they had to do something in response to it. They could not do anything. And I think additionally, I think that the part of the impetus for it was the fact that nationally this issue has picked up steam. And so they wanted to think about how to write a rule that would address the national issue of pretrial. And that's essentially what they came up with.
Okay, so when does the Court of Appeals issued an opinion, right? When does that start?
Well, a rule. It's a ruling.
It's a ruling?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when does that ruling take effect? Has it already?
So it takes effect in July. Chief Judge Morsi issued a memo, I believe, in October, shortly after Attorney General Frosch's opinion. But essentially was like a primer to get judges ready for when the rule goes into effect in July.
Okay. So that brings us, I think, to the legislative question that occurred this year. We had this Court of Appeals ruling, right? And then in the legislature this year, there were competing sets of bail reform bills. Your organization, and you're working with HB 1390 and SB 880, which the Green Party has endorsed. Can you explain a little bit about those bills and then what the other bills are as well?
So I think what's important for the viewers to understand is that there are a bunch of organizations prior to the session, during the summertime and the fall, that were prepping for the session. And these are advocates that many of them actually done work on pretrial before. Some of the organizations actually participated in the 2014 pretrial commission that was convened by the governor at the time. So that work is what produced House Bill 1390, Senate Bill 880. What happened when the Court of Appeals ruling happened in February, for us, it seemed to create greater credence and credibility to this bill. Now, what was also happening parallel, because there were other pretrial bills that were put in.
Yeah, when I was down there, there were several. There was another one that Delegate Moon had seemed to be sort of in the middle.
Exactly, yeah. And so, well, Delegate Moon's bill was actually the elimination of cash bail at the time.
Okay.
Right? So it was actually kind of further left to what we were doing. But then there was also House Bill 1215. My initial understanding of what that bill was kind of a weaker version of what we were doing. That was my initial understanding of what it was, and it didn't really have the kind of traction. Like our House Bill 1390 had, I think, about 30 sponsors on it.
Super.
Right?
Can you explain what your bill does?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So what House Bill 1390 does, it essentially mirrors what the Court of Appeals rule does, where what it says is that judges and court commissioners should exhaust all non-financial conditions before they consider cash bail. So put cash bail kind of at the bottom in the preference for non-financial conditions. What it also did was that mandated that jurisdictions develop a more robust pretrial services, and then develop a risk assessment tool that would be both vetted by the public in collaboration with a local academic institution, and develop kind of their own risk assessment tool that makes sense for their county or city.
So each jurisdiction would have been able to make their own risk assessment.
Right.
Same areas may have something different than Baltimore City.
Right, exactly. Now, and the reason why I kind of began with what I did, which talking about 1215, how it started, because after the Court of Appeals ruling, 1215 began to be the bill that the bail bonds industry supported, and added language that undid the Court of Appeals ruling, right? And that changed the landscape, right? Because it was clear that most of the advocates on pretrial reform were supporting 1390. We had been working on this since the summertime, but we didn't realize that House Bill 1215 was the bail bonds industry's bill until the Senate hearing on March 1st. And the reason we knew that is because it was the bill that the bail bonds industry was testifying in support of. So then as we looked into it further, it became clear to us that there was language added in 1215. So it's House Bill 1215, Senate Bill 983, that undoes the Court of Appeals ruling.
How does that happen? What does the language in that bill do to undo the Court of Appeals ruling?
Essentially, so there are two things that it does that under the Court of Appeals rule. The first is that in it suggested that cash bail can be used as a tool to address public safety, which to Attorney General Frosh and many other advocates around cash bail, our perspective is that cash bail should not be a tool used to punish a person pre-trial, and should be used as a tool to guarantee public safety. So if a person is deemed to be a threat to public safety, you leave them in, you detain them. And so what Senate Bill 983, House Bill 1215 does, in the language, in its initial language, it allowed cash bail to be an instrument for public safety, which undoes the rule, because the rule said explicitly it should. The bigger piece that it does is that it says that there is no preference on conditions that court commissioners use when dealing with the defendant, right? So it undoes the language of the Court of Appeals ruling that says that you exhaust non-financial conditions before you consider bail. What it does do, and it's a very typical co-optation strategy the bail bonds industry uses, which is there's a part of 1215 that says you should consider whether a person's indigent before giving cash bail, right? So that language is there, but essentially it's only consideration, right? In terms of the actual process of giving a defendant a condition, it explicitly says make no preference to any kind of condition, financial or non-financial.
So the Court of Appeals said preference should be given to non-cash alternatives because cash is inherently discriminatory against indigent people. Your bill, 1390 and 880, codified that. And then these other bills that came in that the bail bonds industry was back in 1215 and 983 took that away by removing that preference. Okay.
Yeah.
So where does this legislative process stand right now then on these things, with these competing bills and the Court of Appeals here?
So what happened at a legislative Black Caucus meeting maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Attorney General testified and said that, in his estimation, actually no one knew he was going to say this, but said that he prefers that no bill pass to let the Court of Appeals ruling go into effect And his rationale, and I don't know how much of this he said while testifying about 1390. He said clearly 1215 is a bad bill. But what he said that's about 1390 is that the bail bonds industry will find a way, if it gets to the floor, will find a way to amend it in a way that would undo the Court of Appeals rule. And so he would rather stop all legislation from going through, let the Court of Appeals ruling go through, and then assess what we do for next session. And so, again, we didn't know when you said it at the time, but as the advocates kind of huddled, that made sense to us to try to just, allow the rule to go through. And so what has happened is that the bail bonds industry has now turned up the heat in terms of trying to get something passed. And so where we're at now is that Senate Bill 983 has gotten through the Judiciary Proceedings Committee, gotten through the Senate floor, and it's now in the House Rules Committee. The reason why it's in the House Rules Committee is we were successful, us and other organizations, in pressuring Delegate Kurt Anderson to actually withdraw House Bill 1215. So in any other circumstance, the bill should be dead, right? If you cross-file a bill and it's killed in one chamber, that usually means it's dead. Mm-hmm. We're getting where the chairman of Judiciary is describing 983 as it's come over to the House as a different bill and wants an opportunity to look at it and vote it out. So that's kind of so we want the Speaker and the House Rules Committee to keep Senate Bill 983 in rules because the House sponsor withdrew it.
Okay, so that seems like a pretty specific action. And I want to touch on that right now because I know that since the Green Party has endorsed this, there's been a lot of support for it. The idea of non-cash bail or non-cash alternatives and of decreasing incarceration fall well in line with our values, and we have a lot of folks who are interested in this. So if we have people who are interested in helping out this effort, what do they need to do tomorrow?
So you need to call the Speaker of the House of Delegates, Michael Bush, who is a delegate who represents Anne Arundel County. But you want to call the office of the Speaker of the House of Delegates and demand that he keep the bill in the House Rules Committee. So if it stays in the House Rules Committee, it essentially means it dies.
So that request is pretty specific. Call the Speaker and keep it in the House Rules Committee. Mm-hmm. And how long is the timeline in play for?
So our legislative strategy at this point is to try to run out the clock, right? Okay. So we want session to be over before they have the opportunity to bring it out. Mm-hmm. We think that the Speaker doesn't want a nasty floor fight. So if it happens to get out of the Rules Committee, go to Judiciary. I mean, there are legislators that are willing to make this kind of a long, drawn-out fight, which will undermine some other business they probably want to do and work on. So the more people urge the Speaker to leave it in rules, I think the more that it will give him the cover necessary to say, we don't need a nasty floor fight. There's clearly a lot of fanfare about this. There are people that really don't want this to come out. Let's not take this up on the floor. So the session, we got 2 more weeks of session. We just want to run the clock out.
Okay. And then Tuesday in Annapolis, there's a lobby day for this.
Yeah.
You talked about that so people can get involved.
So Lobby for Justice Day, it's a lobby day, like other interests do lobby days. Gun lobby, pro-choice, all different type of interests they do lobby days. Usually they're in the beginning of session. We actually strategically wanted to put this one at the end of session because we wanted this to be more than a meet and greet with your legislators. Mm-hmm. We really want people to come down and be involved. And so on Tuesday, March 28th, there'll be buses that'll be leaving from multiple locations. On the one from Mondawmin. But if you go on LBS's webpage, Job Opportunities Task Force or Out for Justice, you can RSVP and find information about where buses are leaving from. The buses will leave at 7:30 a.m. and we'll be back in Baltimore about 4 p.m. And the idea will be for folks to talk to the legislators. We're going to try to organize something where we can meet either with the Speaker or the Chief of Staff of the Speaker, so folks can come and to demand that the Speaker keep Senate Bill 983 in the Rules Committee. Mm-hmm. So Tuesday, March 28th, 7 to 4, buses leave Baltimore 7:30. We'll have folks from other parts of the state come through as well. But if you want information about where buses will be leaving. Then if you go to, again, LBS's Facebook page, Alpha Justice, or Job Opportunities Task Force, it'll have the number you can RSVP and find information about what buses do.
Okay, great. And we have our first question from the Facebook Live. The first question is, has there been any impact in court so far from the decision rejecting cash bail?
So that's a very good question. So a February 25th Baltimore Sun article is quoted as saying, I think Kevin Rector wrote it, since the Court of Appeals ruling, there have been 1,400 less cash bails given. There's a Washington Post article where a bail bondsman is quoted as saying that he's lost 70% of his business since the Court of Appeals ruling, which is, again, the motivation as to why the bail bonds industry is fighting so hard to try to get Senate Bill 983, because I think they're seeing an effect on their bottom line because of the Court of Appeals ruling.
So what do you say about that? The bail bonds industry says they've done a lot of good work to get people out of incarceration over time, right? And that this ruling will put them out of business, right? What do you say to that?
I mean, it's like saying that the 13th Amendment puts slave catchers out of business. It's like it's an industry that profiteers off of a price tag being put over whether or not a person stays incarcerated, something they haven't been convicted of yet. And so, I mean, and there are people we've seen online, people who are bail bonds, who are like, this is hurting my business. And this is really the sick part about putting profit incentives and profit motives connected to criminal justice. The analogy I gave when I testified in both the Senate and the House Judiciary Committees is that, the outgoing Obama administration, right, took a stance against private persons, right, and it's something that folks should have done a long time ago, right? But if the corporate Democratic Party outgoing administration is saying no privatization of prisons because of the profit motive that really generated a lot of the issues of the war on drugs we've seen in the past 40 years, the bail bonds industry is similar to that, right? So the idea of a profit motive dependent on people being incarcerated is something we should fundamentally be against. And, last year we had the Maryland Justice Reinvestment Act all around this idea of addressing mass incarceration, which just seems, out of step with the direction that the state of Maryland has said it wants to go in, to not just let the court rule go into effect and do more work in terms of addressing the pretrial system.
So you have this pretrial system which the bail bonds industry is benefiting, their entire existence is based off of. You mentioned that their industry and their lobbyists were pushing hard for 154 bill. Can you talk about some of the influence that they have in Annapolis?
Absolutely. So I'll give a couple of examples. The first is that the bail bonds industry was able to get the Black Caucus, the Legislative Black Caucus, to send out an invitation, again, through its listserv of Black legislators, to a dinner at the Reese Chris in Annapolis, to essentially wine and dine. Now, this isn't something that is, unprecedented, right? The dinners that happen all the time in Annapolis. But it just goes to show the extent to which they have influence, and they're strategic. I mean, they're really, deliberate in targeting Black legislators, because I think they kind of preempted what advocates would say, which is it's an industry that disproportionately affects Black folks. So that was part of their strategy. Other things that they were able to do is they were able to get the major civil rights organizations to support their bill, along with the bail bonds industry. So we're talking the state NAACP, the local chapter of the National Action Network, the National Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Greater Baltimore Urban League.
And they flew in the guy from the SCLC
Right.
in order to.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the most shocking moments of the hearing when we were down there in Annapolis was when the head of the SCLC basically said, "In the name of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, I'm here to speak in favor of bail."
Right. It was bad. It was really bad. And what it told me, so they spent a lot of money to do that. One of the things we've been, LBS, we've been joking about, it has to be like an out of touch white person in charge of their efforts, because anybody that really understands the politics of this wouldn't have thought that we get the major civil rights organizations that, oh, the black people are going to be good, right? But that's essentially what their strategy was: is we're going to buy off, the traditional civil rights organizations to get black folks in order to support their effort. But again, it just goes to show like the level of influence they've been able to get organizations that traditionally would be on our side. And it was actually really disappointing to see some of the people that I know supporting this piece of legislation. It was just one other example. There's a local radio host, Larry Young at WOLB 1010, who is a big supporter of the bail bonds industry. He actually attended that dinner that I mentioned earlier. And when I posted on Facebook my disappointment in the National Action Network supporting that bill, and my displeasure with the National Action Network generally, I was invited on the show, where, we were having a conversation about the bail bonds industry. And the impression that I got from that was that he was a supporter of the bail bonds industry, right? That my assumption, this is just my opinion, my guess, is that he's paid off by the bail bonds industry to use his platform to support the bail bonds industry. So that's just a level of influence and power that we've observed this session, that, you have to have a lot of money to pull it off.
And I think this actually speaks to the next question that we have from one of the viewers. What is your position on bail reform? And New Jersey, it's begun, but the prosecutors and law enforcement are currently trying to undermine it. And that comes from a Green Party person in New Jersey. So what's your thought about that? Like, how do we get bail reform that doesn't get undermined by law enforcement and prosecutors?
A couple things. One is my understanding of New Jersey's iteration of bail reform is that they eliminated cash bail, in its entirety. And one of the reasons why we didn't actively support Delegate Moon's bill, which was the bill that would have eliminated cash bail, because what we want to do, the most important part of the pretrial reform piece, is to establish a robust pretrial system that is an alternative to incarceration. But if you don't set up that infrastructure, then it creates a context where you have some people that have conditions and then get sent back because of violation of conditions or whatever it may be. So if you don't establish a robust pretrial system, then really just ending cash bail doesn't work. And then the other piece is that politically, for states' attorneys and law enforcement, it is a tool that they're used to using as a mechanism for public safety. And again, if we don't have good alternatives, if we don't build those alternatives, then those are the kinds of industries or professions that are going to just reach to use bail as that tool.
I want to talk about this. I think this point you make about building a robust pretrial system is a really useful one. And I think that one of the things that the Green Party liked most about this bill was that it looks to build community organizations that can intervene in the pretrial system, aside from keeping people incarcerated. So what do some of these things look like that are part of this robust pretrial system?
So the idea I mentioned earlier, like community mediation, would be an example. Let's say someone gets picked up on possession with intent to distribute, right? You have a robust pretrial system where you'd have a risk assessment tool that's administered by a community worker of some sort, a therapist, social worker, whatever. And they might look at that person and say, you know what, this person's not a drug dealer. They're addicted to drugs. So let's make a pretrial condition that they participate in a program, right? Pre-trial, as opposed to, so those kind of things.
So mediation, rehab, for both drugs and alcohol, other interventions, monitoring, things like that. And I think one of the things that's most interesting is that it bubbles up from the community.
Right.
And so the community that is most affected and afflicted by the problem that the crime caused has an opportunity to have input on the remediation of that.
And this was really important to us because there are iterations of pretrial reform. Like the last time, this kind of got a committee, a good pretrial bill in 2014. One of the worst parts about it was that the risk assessment tool, the term they used to describe it was R2D2, right? Like a computer just making a decision about whether a person is a threat to public safety and what the condition should be. And our perspective, and we wrote about this very early, like before session started, was we need a pretrial system that is clear that communities are part of co-designing and administering those pretrial services. It can't just be your typical bureaucratic government program, right? It has to be community-based programs where folks who interact with that population on a regular basis are the ones that are going to have the best ability to determine who's a threat to public safety, right? Because the community would know, determine what kind of conditions make sense for individuals there. And again, not just a bureaucratic government program that is just, making decisions about whether people go in or out. Because we saw that as being something that could potentially be very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. So, I got one more, or another Facebook Live question. Is there corruption between bail bondsmen, prosecutors, and commissioners who set bail?
So, one of the people that testified in support of our efforts is former Judge Billy Murphy. He said something really interesting that I hadn't really thought a lot about, which was that a part of how the bail bonds industry stays in business is that when folks get bail, they refer them to certain lawyers. So he said it's a practice that's been happening for a long time that people don't talk about publicly. But there are a lot of people who practice law who support the bail bonds industry because it is a kind of a solid and consistent revenue stream that they're likely to get.
So basically, bail bonds people are putting conditions of people for providing bail to them, which funnel them to certain lawyers. Right. And so there's a question, how do you put these conditions on people as the state? And it seems like kind of what you're saying is that the bail bonds industry is already putting these conditions on people, but it's outside of regulation of the courts and this type of thing.
Right. I mean, one of the things I have to be clear about in my testimony, because one of the things the bail bonds industry was saying about their business is, we use families, we get families together. That's what we rely on to make sure people show up. And one of the things I, felt was important to say is the bail bonds industry are not human social service workers. They're not trained to effectively improve the quality of life of community or create an environment that is, beneficial. That's not what they're charged to do. And so the idea of having a private industry that's about making money, we shouldn't depend on that industry for doing what is really necessary, which is addressing the issues that cause people to be in the pretrial system.
And I think that part of it is really important because it stops people from, it allows people to go back to their life, get ready for trial, and engage the community instead of sitting in jail. Right. Because I think one of the things that's lost in this question of bail, I think it's hard for folks to wrap around different economic conditions of folks facing bail. Because sitting in jail while you're waiting trial, it could be months, it could be a long time. You likely lose a job if you don't attend it. Child care becomes a problem. All of these very human concerns really become a problem, right? And it's simply for the same crime, a different punishment. And I think that's the part that once I got my head wrapped around this, I was totally understood, right? If two people get charged with the same crime and one of them can make bail and the other one has to sit in prison or sit in jail, that's unfair. And I think that's what the Court of Appeals decision is getting at. So, do you have another question? Oh, okay, great. Thank you. So on Twitter, Jerome Briscoe says anything less than the moon bill is a cop-out. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, again, it goes back to, in other states like New Jersey and Kentucky, some of the issues that they're having is that they're prioritizing the elimination of cash bail over the development of a robust pretrial system that can manage and handle it. And so while I understand that ideologically, it would feel better to say, let's eliminate cash bail, the real issue is making sure that we have a robust pretrial system to provide those alternatives. Because what we don't want, and this is the thing that we have to explain to folks, who see themselves as really progressive and ideologically pure, is that, and actually two things. One is that we don't want judges to decide because we don't have conditions. We're just going to leave them in, right? And there are a lot of judges who will do that, right? So we don't have a robust pretrial system and just eliminate cash bail. we become susceptible to that. The other thing is that if we understand the idea of giving the community power, we want to make sure that there's a robust pretrial system so that the community makes a determination about who is a threat to public safety, right? And so just to say eliminate cash bail, I mean, there are folks that people in community don't want out in community, right? And that's just the reality of the situation. And so what we want to prioritize the establishment of that pretrial system so that we have the tools to make the determination about who is a danger to public safety.
So basically, lay the groundwork in order to make the cash bail system obsolete,
right,
instead of outlawing it.
Right, because the idea is with House Bill 1390 and the Court of Appeals ruling, the idea is to render it obsolete, right? And one of the concerns that some folks have expressed in jurisdictions that aren't the major ones, are that judges will, because they don't have options, will just keep a person instead of giving them cash bail. So that's why that pretrial part is important. We can't just say eliminate cash bail. We got to provide an alternative so that those judges don't say, well, hell, I can't give you a bail, right, so I'm just going to leave you in.
So how many in Baltimore, you've mentioned that there's some alternatives. In St. Mary's, you've mentioned that there are alternatives. How many of the counties in the state have the capacity to set up an alternative at this point?
Well, there are currently, I think, like 11 or 12 jurisdictions that have pretrial services. And in fact, Montgomery County, by many accounts, has the best pretrial services in the state of Maryland. And one of the things that they're finding is that it's very successful, places like Montgomery County. So the idea is for the jurisdictions that already have it, for them to kind of integrate more community-based alternatives. And then those jurisdictions that don't, help them to begin to develop them.
So another question just came in online, and that's I think a good point. The question is, who does the cash bail system hurt the most, and what kind of people? And I think that we've had a great discussion about legislation and strategy and policy. But let's talk about the human stories of this for a moment, and who this impacts.
So if you go, there's a report that the Office of the Public Defender did called The High Cost of Cash Bail. I suggest folks read it. I'll just give you a few statistics that I think really illustrate some of this, and then just give you examples of some stories. Since 2011, in the state of Maryland, the bail bonds industry has made $75 million off of people not convicted of anything. So no process, non-convictions. $75 million off of people convicted of that. Over the past 5 years, the bail bonds industry overall has made $265 million. The top three jurisdictions in terms of revenue from the bail bonds industry are in Baltimore City, right? So like Park Heights, Old Town, right? Sandtown, Winchester are like the top three zip codes in terms of revenue generation for the bail bonds industry. So, and if you look at some of the charts that are in the report, it's very clear that Black folks are overrepresented, way overrepresented in terms of folks that are paying cash bail versus other racial demographics. So we're talking about poor and working class Black people that are most directly impacted by that. And two, because my lane when I'm in Annapolis is more about the policy stuff, there are other people that talk about some of the stories behind it. But I have an uncle who, when I was a freshman in college, who was working at a pharmacy, who was locked up without bail. It turns out that in the 90s, he was on probation, and the person who was supervising him forgot to check the thing that said he was done probation. So it read as a failure to appear for probation, but he stayed in jail for like a couple of months, lost his job. It was really bad for him. I remember like going down to try to find out what happened, but and he wasn't a threat to public safety. He wasn't, so those are the kinds of things that, and I had a younger brother who someone falsely accused him of like burning down someone's establishment. They just went. And so he had to pay, it was like a $10,000 bail. We had to come up with $1,000. to get him out. He had no history prior, any kind of violent criminal history.
And it often seems, I would think, the people who are most distressed by paying $1,000 bail are also the ones most likely to lose a job if they don't pay it.
Right. Exactly.
So we have another question coming in here. How about a system that requires advocates as conditions of release? The more serious the crime, the more advocates you need to vouch for you.
Hadn't thought about that. I guess in theory that sounds like something that's possible. I haven't thought about that.
Would this be part of a pretrial condition that would be, if the community came up with it, it could be something that helps in that regard?
Yeah, I can imagine cases, like using the example of people getting into an altercation. I can see that as something that might be a condition, or someone that has, who's bipolar, like has some kind of medical condition. I can see that being an alternative.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there's certain examples that we've both seen where advocates can help to get somebody free. I can think of one example.
Yeah.
But so I think that's a good question. What are some of the what does this look like outside of Baltimore City? Right, this is a statewide bill, and a lot of the conversation that we're having is very Baltimore focused.
Mm-hmm.
But what does it look like in other jurisdictions? Are there bail problems in Washington County and Garrett County and these places as well? Or is it just the high population areas?
I mean, Baltimore City and Prince George's County, obviously the ones that are the most directly impacted by the system. Other jurisdictions, there are examples. So some of the opponents of our position have made the point that they're worried about judges in obscure counties making determinations about holding people because they don't, they prefer not to give them cash bail. And, what for me, what that means is that requires then, that's why it's important to build a pretrial system so that judges have alternatives. But part of what's happening is that example is being used as a rationale against what we're trying to do, as opposed to saying what that means, that you just need a pretrial system, and that you reduce the prison population by having a pretrial system that ensures people return to court. It costs about $150 a day on average to incarcerate someone on pretrial, whereas a lot of the program we were talking about is between $14 to $25 a day. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about massive amounts of savings by having a robust pretrial system.
So now, if something goes to mediation, right, that doesn't stop that person from having a trial. Right. This is not a alternative to the justice system.
Right.
This is an alternative to a pretrial detention system.
Right. What may happen, though, is the defense attorney and the prosecutor may say, hey, based off of what happened, the prosecutor may say, we'll drop the charges. It seems like it's dealt with. Because what we want to find ways to address these things that don't require the court system, right? And so these conditions, I think, provide opportunities potentially for avoiding having to go to court.
Mm-hmm. So they're alternatives. They're designed as alternatives to pretrial, but a robust pretrial system also potentially keeps people out of post-trial incarceration as well. Okay, I think that's a good part to understand about this. Now, are there networks in So, real quick, you mentioned that the bail industry is behind the other bill. Who's behind the bill, and who are the folks that are arrayed against them that are supporting the bill and the approach that you're working on? Wait, there's two bills. Mm-hmm. One is backed by the bill.
There's one bill now.
Okay, we withdrew. There's two efforts. Mm-hmm. There's one to match the Court of Appeals. There's one to prop up the bail industry. Mm-hmm. Who are the groups of people who are supporting your effort?
Oh, okay, got it. I'll put it this way: there was a senator on the floor of the Senate who said, "I'm voting against this bill because the only people that have talked to me about Senate Bill 983 is the bail bonds industry. No advocates of the poor, no state's attorneys, nobody that deals with this, just the bail bonds industry."
And that was a pretty good signal.
Yeah.
Okay, so that makes sense. And then in the sort of coalition that you're working with are advocates for people, social service workers, and folks who understand really the most direct impact of it without a profit motive connected to it.
Yep.
Okay. Is there another question? Great, thank you. Okay. So this is a comment. It says the financial incentive for judges to give time in prison for profit system has ruined lives. Right. I think that's what you're saying is that it occurs both in the pretrial part of it, but it also occurs in any part where there's a profit motive for incarceration. Lives are ruined and thrown away for that profit motive. So I think that another question that I have about this is where does this effort go? So say you sit on the ball and you get out of the session this time. You take a day off, and then after that day off, what's the next step look like on this for you to make sure that these issues are addressed and this robust pretrial system is built?
Well, one of the things that we did was we convened a conference call with some local human social service providers to attempt to facilitate the collaboration of community-based organizations and pretrial services. So one track is just trying to get more community-based entities collaborating with pretrial, and that's an organizing piece. And the legislative piece is to look at, how to get a version of 1390 through the General Assembly to codify it, but also require those pretrial services to exist in those different jurisdictions, while simultaneously working to make sure that the bail bonds industry doesn't put in a bill next year to try to undo the Court of Appeals rule.
So organized to build the network of pretrial advocates and pretrial services, and then continue the legislative effort to try to get something like 1390 this year. And where can people find out more about that effort as the time goes on?
We'll continue to keep checking out LBS's Facebook page and our website, which will be giving updates both about the legislative piece and about the opportunities to try to network organizations with the pretrial services.
Okay, great. And that website is
lbsbaltimore.com.
Okay. Next question. What is the impact of donations from the bail industry in the legislature in Annapolis?
So the best way to put it is this. Common Cause did a report where they analyzed financial contributions from the bail bonds industry legislators. Our chair of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee, Bobby Zirkin, and the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Joe Valerio, are second and third, I don't know which order, are second and third in the United States in campaign contributions from the bail bonds industry. Both chairs have been impediments to bail reform. Zirkin is the reason the Senate Bill 983 got out of committee onto the floor. He was very adamant about that. And it is Joe Valerio on the House side that wants Senate Bill 983 to come out of rules into his committee. So the bail bonds industry has been very strategic in getting the chairs of the committees that the bill would need to come out of in order to try to get their agenda started.
So they understand that there's reform and they use their money well.
Right.
All right, another question we have here. How does an unjust bail system add to the injustice of the court system, trials, rehabilitation, etc.?
Well, a few things. One is that it doesn't address the problem. People are talking about dealing with, drug addiction as a public health issue as opposed to a criminal issue. Well, cash bail doesn't advance that. As I mentioned earlier, what former Judge Murphy said about, bail bondsmen funneling business to certain lawyers. So there's that piece. It also creates a condition where a lot of people that are incarcerated, pre-trial, are more apt to just say, okay, I'll plead in order to get out, because I don't want to, be in here any longer than I have to be.
So in some ways, they take a plea because that shortens their pre-trial sentence, right? And probably gets a conviction that they would have served less time on, right? But then they have a record.
Exactly.
And then that has to get expunged,
right?
And the whole process begins again. I think that this sort of every aspect of this costs money,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not just the cash bail that costs money,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you take a plea, it costs money.
Mm-hmm.
If you take, so that at each part of this, people with the least amount of money are paying the highest price. And one of the pieces of testimony that I heard when I was down there reflected the way that this really has even a small bail amount. Oftentimes, especially on younger folks who may not have family who can help them with it, makes the difference between whether they spend a night in jail for a mistake or whether they spend weeks before a conviction. And we all know that once you're inside, it has an effect on people, right? And I mean, I think that the thing that most struck me about this was hearing stories from some of the people who had like a FTA for a traffic ticket or something, right? Driving on a suspended license and got put in and, and didn't have a way to get out. And spent weeks, weeks in jail, child care, whereas somebody else charged with exactly the same thing just flexes and gets it out.
One thing that Nicole Hansen from Out for Justice, she's the executive director of Out for Justice, an ex-offender-led organization. One of the things that she testified on was two things. One is if you're a person that you don't have the money, so you have to go to your family to help you pay bail. One of the things she points out is that you become less willing to go around your family members after that because you owe the money.
You're not going to pay back.
You're not going to be able to pay back. Yeah, right. But people want their money back. So create strained relationships. And then the other thing she also mentions, in her talk about this is that there's some bail bondsmen that you can put down 1% and then you do a payment plan. And a part of the way it's structured is you have some people that are paying from bails from years ago, right, because of the financing. So it just becomes another means of wealth extraction because even though you might pay, $200, 1% of the bail, you're having to pay, $150, $200 a month. And for a person that makes $15,000 to $20,000 a year, I mean, that's your food for the month or your BG bill.
Now, you mentioned at the beginning, you mentioned that LBS's work is primarily with young people and some industry education work. How do the young people that you interact with relate to and know about the bail system?
So we actually, on the day of the House hearing, there's a program in Baltimore called Keys Development. They actually brought down some fourth graders to show them how the process works and tell them about the bail system. It was interesting because I was asked to kind of give them an overview of what they were going to hear about there. And one of the things that was really sad is when I asked them if they knew what bail was, they all knew. Fourth graders. They all knew what it was, and we asked them how it works. They all knew how it worked, because they had, cousins, brothers, uncles, that have been impacted by the system, So even like real young people, right, they're impacted by it because they're folks who are missing in their lives for large periods of time. And that's why.
And then there's other folks in their lives that have leveraged their home or leveraged their car in order to get somebody out. Right. So what do we do? So this is a piece of legislation the Green Party has endorsed. It's entirely in line with the platform that we have on criminal justice. Taking off the politics of the possible hat for a moment and thinking about what the ideal system would be for you when it comes to pretrial. We're considering, platform. We're considering taking this endorsement and moving it into a platform piece. If we were to have a platform piece that spoke to your ideal world on how the state of Maryland should handle bail, what would that look like to you?
Again, it would
be 1390.
Yeah, it would be 1390. Robust pretrial system and connecting community-based organizations to the pretrial system. Because I do want to reiterate that just having a pretrial system that is a bureaucratic government-run program is not that would be bad.
So, the question then becomes how to get the community involved at a grassroots level, a democratic process of of engaging in this pre-trial process.
Right.
So
And giving them the investment necessary to effectively do pre-trial services.
So that's the next step to push for. You have 1390, which calls for the creation of that system, integrates the conditions necessary, and the next step is to make sure that the community is able to create the evaluation tool.
Exactly. And essentially, when you think about like the Justice Reinvestment Act, which is this idea of decreasing the prison population in order to benefit from the savings from decreasing the rate of incarceration, well, that savings needs to go to these community-based organizations to do this work. Because essentially, they're on the front end, which will help to push people away from the criminal justice system, as opposed to the cash bail system, which essentially is sucking people into the criminal justice system.
Okay, so and I think that framing of it is making sure that the communities are as empowered as they can be. Because at the end of the day, one of the points that you make that I really liked on this is that it is the community who should help to determine who is a threat to public safety. Yeah. Right? Because it doesn't pretend that in communities where there is a lot of people who suffer from cash bail, there are not also people who are a threat to public safety. Yeah. Right? And that the more community involvement is in that, the more likely it is to produce the right answer. Exactly. So, are there any other questions that have come in? All right. Well, are you ready to wrap up? Pretty much. I think questions are winding down on this. So, well, thank you very much to Dayvon Love, the leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. The Green Party has endorsed both of these bills, and we'll be sending out action updates to get more things, but also follow the Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle page. Hope folks can come out to Annapolis on Tuesday. Check in the links that are provided in the comments here for the link to the event and where you can get buses. And thank you all for tuning in tonight. And thank you, Dayvon.
Yep. Thanks, Andy.
All right. Thanks.